The courtroom was silent. My stepdaughter Patricia was on her feet, pointing at me across the aisle. Her finger was steady. Her voice was steady. She had been rehearsing this moment for months. I could hear it in the way she never stumbled, never paused, never once looked at notes. "This man," she said, whispered in our dying mother's ear every single night until she changed her will. "He cut us out of everything our family built together. He isolated her from her own children when she needed us most. And then our mother died. And he got everything." I sat at that table and I did not move. 32 years of designing buildings had taught me one thing that had nothing to do with architecture. When a structure is under attack, the worst possible response is panic. You wait. You assess. You look at what is actually failing and what is actually holding. You act only when you understand the full picture. I understood the full picture. 300 people had loved Rose Hadley in her lifetime. Her children were not among them. Not anymore. Not since the money became the point. I reached into the folder in front of me and I touched the envelope inside it. I had read what was inside it so many times I could close my eyes and hear Rose's voice reading every word of it back to me, her specific handwriting, her precise phrasing, her exact words about exactly this moment. She had written it 18 months before she died. She had sealed it herself. She had given it to her own attorney, not mine, hers, with a single instruction written on the outside of the envelope. "Open this only if my children contest the will." They had contested the will. Patricia was still pointing. The judge was listening. The paid witness they had hired to lie was waiting in the hallway outside. And my late wife, the woman Patricia was calling a victim, had already answered every single word being spoken in that courtroom. She had answered it 18 months ago. She had just been waiting for her children to give her a reason to be heard. If you have ever watched someone stand up and lie about a person you loved, subscribe to The Steady Father and stay with me. Because this story ends exactly the way Rose intended it to end. To understand why her children stood in that courtroom, and what the letter contained, and how a woman who had been dead for 8 months walked into a hearing and won it, I need to take you back to the beginning. I need to tell you about Rose. Rose did not have an easy first marriage. I will not speak badly of a man who has been dead for 12 years. But I will tell you what the shape of that marriage produced: 3 children raised largely alone by a woman working 2 jobs, a house that was not peaceful, a mother who never complained and never asked for recognition and never once told her children that their father had let her carry everything while he watched. She protected them from that knowledge. She protected them from it for 20 years. And they grew up not knowing the full weight of what she had carried, which meant they also grew up not knowing the full measure of the woman who had carried it. That was Rose's mistake, if she made one. She was too generous with her protection. When the marriage ended in 1995, Rose was 41 years old. She had a house she was paying for alone, 3 teenagers who needed different things from her simultaneously, and approximately nothing left in her personal reserves after 2 decades of a marriage that had taken everything and given back very little. She started over. Quietly. Without drama. Without asking anyone to notice. She worked. She saved. She organized. She went, every Tuesday evening, to charity auctions at the Children's Hospital where she had begun volunteering on the specific logic that her own children were grown enough to not need her every hour, and that other people's children were in need of people who showed up on Tuesday evenings, and that she was a person who could show up on Tuesday evenings and so she would. I met her at one of those Tuesday evening auctions in 1998. She was standing near a painting that was not going to sell. The bidding had stalled at $300. The minimum reserve was $500. Most people in the room had moved on. Rose had not moved on. She was bidding against herself, incrementally, carefully, trying to get the painting to its minimum without making the effort visible. I was watching her do this from across the room. It was the most precisely determined thing I had seen in years, and I had spent my career surrounded by people who were precise. I walked over. I said, without thinking it through, "You're going to run out of money before you run out of stubbornness." She turned around slowly. She looked at me for exactly 1 second with an expression that I can only describe as the look of a woman who has been underestimated by men for 40 years and is deciding, in real time, whether this particular instance warrants a response. She said, "You clearly haven't met me." She got the painting to $502. It was the most precise victory I had ever witnessed in any room in any context. I asked her to dinner that same night. She said she needed to think about it, which was the answer of a person who actually needed to think about it rather than the answer of a person performing deliberation. She called me the following morning and said yes. We were married 3 years later. We had 19 years together before the cancer took her, 19 years of Tuesday evening auctions and Sunday morning arguments and August vacations and the specific ordinary happiness of two people who have both survived difficult first chapters and know, from the inside of that survival, how rare ordinary happiness actually is. Her children were not glad we married. They were not glad when we dated. They had not been glad when I moved into the house Rose owned, or when I paid off the mortgage she had been carrying alone, or when I funded Victor's failed restaurant business without complaint, or when I helped Patricia with a down payment on a house she subsequently sold at a loss. They took what they needed and offered very little in return. This was consistent enough that I had come to understand it as simply the shape of those relationships, and I had made my peace with the shape. But I want to tell you about one specific moment, because it tells you everything you need to know about who Victor Morrison was and what this fight was really about long before it became a legal fight. 3 weeks after Rose received her cancer diagnosis, 3 weeks, when we were still navigating the shock of it, when she was still going through her first round of specialist consultations, when neither of us had slept properly in 10 days, Victor called. I answered. Rose was resting. He did not ask how she was. He asked one question, smoothly, calmly, the way he asked questions he had been sitting with for a while. Has Mom thought about putting the house into a family trust? For tax purposes. It might make things simpler later on. I stood in the kitchen holding the phone, looking at the door to the bedroom where his mother was sleeping after her third oncology appointment in 2 weeks. I thought about what it meant that the third sentence out of his mouth, not the first, not the second, but the third, was about the house. I said, Victor, your mother just got a terminal diagnosis. I don't think now is the time to talk about the house. He said, I'm just trying to be practical, George. Someone has to be. I hung up. I stood in the kitchen for a long time after that. I thought about telling Rose when she woke up. I decided not to, because she had enough to carry, and because telling her would have confirmed what she already knew about her oldest son, and she did not need that confirmed while she was trying to survive 14 months of cancer with whatever grace and attention she could give to what actually mattered. I told her eventually. She nodded, the way she nodded when something she had already calculated arrived as confirmation rather than surprise. She said, he called you about the house. Not a question. A statement. 3 weeks in, I said. Yes, she said. That sounds right. She did not say anything else about it. She went back to what she had been doing, which was reading the information packet her oncologist had given her, with the specific focused attention of a woman who had decided that understanding her situation completely was the most useful response available to her. That was Rose. That was who she was dealing with. That was the family she loved without illusions. And that phone call, Victor's voice, smooth and practical, asking about the house 3 weeks after his mother's terminal diagnosis, was the first sentence of everything that followed. The legal contest, the paid witness, the courtroom, all of it. It started with that phone call in my kitchen while Rose slept. I just didn't know it yet. Rose knew. She already knew. Rose knew. She saw her children clearly. She loved them without illusions, which is the most exhausting and the most generous form of love available, and she had been practicing it for 40 years. What I did not know, what she had specifically chosen not to tell me, was that she had also been preparing. For 18 months before her death, Rose Hadley had been building something. She had been building a defense for the life she and I had lived together, against the attack she understood, with the specific clarity she brought to everything, was coming. She had not told me. She had not wanted the remaining time between us to feel like a countdown to a battle. That was Rose. That was entirely Rose. And the defense she built was the most complete and honest answer to a lie that I have ever seen delivered in any form, in any room, by any person. Let me tell you how she built it. Rose died on a Wednesday in March. She had asked me to leave the bedroom window open. She wanted to smell the outside when the time came. I left it open. The air that morning was cold and smelled like rain and the last of winter, and she breathed it in while I held her hand, and at 7:14 she was gone. 14 months from diagnosis to death. Ovarian cancer, stage 3, found late because Rose had a way of attributing her own symptoms to less serious causes. She was not a complainer and she was not an alarmist, and this served her poorly in the one situation where alarming herself earlier would have mattered most. She handled the diagnosis the way she handled everything. She organized. She made appointments. She had 3 conversations with her personal attorney, a woman named Helen Park who had handled Rose's individual legal matters since before we married. She did not tell me about those conversations. She told me why in the letter, later. She said she did not want me to know she was preparing, because knowing would have made the remaining time feel like a countdown to something rather than a continuation of our life together. She was right not to tell me. I would have spiraled. She knew this. Victor visited twice in 14 months. Patricia 4 times. Diane came most often and had the most genuine relationship of the 3 with her mother, though even Diane's visits had a quality that Rose described to me one late night as feeling like a property inspection. She said it without bitterness. Rose described things as they were and did not editorialize them. The description itself was editorial enough. After the funeral, after the initial weeks of the grief that did not lift so much as change shape, I began to understand something that should have been visible earlier. Her children were not grieving. They were waiting. Victor called me 2 months after the funeral. No condolences. Straight to business. He wanted to talk about the investment accounts. I told him the accounts had been left to me in Rose's will and would pass to the 3 children equally upon my death. He said, "We're going to need to discuss that." I said, "Rose made her wishes clear." He said, "Rose was not well when she made those wishes." That was the beginning. That was the first sentence of the fight they had been building toward since before she was in the ground. The will was not complicated. It was not a surprise to me. Rose had told me the broad outlines of it years earlier, the way people who have been through difficult first chapters tend to discuss these things, directly, without avoidance, because they have already learned what happens when you avoid practical reality. She left me the house and the investment accounts. Upon my death, everything would pass equally to her 3 children. The art collection was divided immediately, specific pieces designated for each child based on conversations Rose remembered having with them over the years. Victor received a landscape he had admired at 17. Patricia received a coastal print she had commented on the year before the diagnosis. Diane received a small watercolor of a garden that had been Rose's personal favorite. Victor and Patricia received their pieces. Within 6 weeks of the funeral, both had listed them with auction houses. I found out about this from Diane, who called me to tell me and who sounded, when she told me, like a person reporting something that did not surprise her but that had still managed to land badly. 2 months later, Victor called about the investment accounts. Then the attorney letters arrived. Then the formal will contest was filed. 3 claims. First, Rose had lacked cognitive capacity when the will was executed. Second, I had exercised undue influence over Rose during her illness, isolating her from her children and directing her decisions. Third, a signed declaration from a woman named Sandra Norris, who called herself a private nursing aide who had attended Rose in her final months and who stated she had personally witnessed me pressuring Rose about the will on multiple occasions. I had never met Sandra Norris. There had been no private nursing aide. Rose had been cared for by a hospice team and by me. No one else had been present in the way Norris described. I read her declaration 3 times. Then I turned it over. On the back, the declaration listed the specific dates on which Sandra Norris claimed to have been present in our home, the dates on which she claimed to have witnessed me pressuring Rose about the will. I stared at those dates for a long moment. Then I walked to my desk and opened the folder where I kept Rose's medical appointment calendar, the one I had maintained obsessively during her illness, every appointment, every treatment, every hospital visit, written in my own handwriting because keeping records was the one practical thing I could do when everything else felt out of my control. I checked the first date Norris had listed. Rose had been at the hospital that day for a 6-hour chemotherapy infusion. Not at home. At the hospital, connected to N4, in a treatment chair. I checked the second date. Same. Hospital. Oncology ward. The third date. Hospital again. A specialist consultation that had run 3 hours over schedule and that I remembered specifically because we had not gotten home until nearly 9 at night and Rose had been exhausted and I had made soup from a can because neither of us had the energy for anything more. Every single date that Sandra Norris had listed as a day she had been in our home, watching me whisper in Rose's ear, every single one, was a day Rose had been in the hospital. Whoever had written that declaration had not just lied about what they witnessed. They had not even bothered to check a calendar. They had been so certain I would not fight back. So certain a grieving old widower would simply fold. They had paid a woman to sign a piece of paper and they had not even checked the dates. I sat at my desk for a long time. I felt something move through me that was not anger exactly, it was colder than anger, cleaner, the specific feeling of a man who has just understood precisely what he is dealing with and precisely how to deal with it. Then I called Carol Webb. The formal contest was filed 4 months after Rose's death, by attorneys representing Victor and Patricia jointly. Diane did not join. She called me the day before it was filed. She said she had been asked and had refused, and that she was sorry. I told her I knew, and that I understood what refusing had cost her, because Victor's pressure on family members was never gentle. 3 claims, packaged in legal language designed to sound measured and concerned. 1. Rose lacked cognitive capacity when the will was executed. 2. I had exercised undue influence, isolating her from her children during her illness and directing her decisions in my favor. 3. A signed declaration from Sandra Norris, a woman who called herself a private nursing aide, who claimed to have been present in our home during Rose's final 3 months and to have personally witnessed me pressuring Rose about the will, repeatedly, in language she described as insistent and frightening to a woman who was physically weakened. I had never met Sandra Norris. I had never employed a private nursing aide. Rose had been cared for by a hospice team and by me, alone, without any additional aid at any point during the 14 months of her illness. I read Norris's declaration 3 times, slowly, the way I read structural engineering reports before signing off on a building, looking for the load-bearing claims, the places where the weight of the argument rested. What I found was a declaration that was specific enough to be convincing but vague enough to be invented. Correct address. Wrong details. The language of someone who had been coached on what to say by a person who had described our home from the outside without ever having been in it. I called Carol Webb. Carol Webb was 57 years old, a will contest specialist who had been recommended to me by my own regular attorney with the specific words, "If someone is lying about the circumstances of a will execution, Carol is the person who finds out how and proves it." She had short gray hair and a quality of focused skepticism that I recognized immediately as the professional equivalent of what Rose had called not being fooled by the presentation. She read the contest filing in my presence, without comment, and when she finished she set it down and said, "Tell me about Sandra Norris." I told her I had never heard the name before reading the declaration. "Is it possible you simply didn't know a nursing aide was engaged?" she asked. "No," I said. "I was present every day for the entire 14 months of Rose's illness. I was there for every medical appointment, every hospice visit, every conversation with every person who came through our home. There was no Sandra Norris." Carol looked at me for a moment with the evaluating expression of a professional who has heard many people say things they believe to be true. "All right," she said. "Then Sandra Norris is either genuinely confused about the address and has made a declaration about the wrong patient, or she has been paid to make a false statement." "The second one," I said. "That's also what I think," she said. "Which means we need to find out who paid her, why she agreed to it, and what we can document about both." She opened a legal pad. "Tell me everything about Victor and Patricia. Start from the beginning." I talked for 2 hours. Carol asked questions that were precise and occasionally uncomfortable, including questions about my own conduct during Rose's illness that required me to examine memories I had not wanted to examine. She did this without apology and without cruelty, in the manner of a professional who understands that the truth is more useful than comfort and that her client's interests are best served by the truth regardless of whether it is comfortable. At the end of 2 hours, she said, "I want to hire an investigator to look at Sandra Norris. And I want to contact Helen Park." Helen Park was Rose's personal attorney. The attorney who had been present for the 3 conversations Rose had not told me about. "She's bound by attorney-client privilege," I said. "Normally yes," Carol said. "But if Rose left instructions for the privilege to be waived in specific circumstances, which I suspect she did, then we may have access to whatever Rose discussed with her." She paused. "Did Rose ever mention Helen Park to you?" "Once," I said. "She said Helen was the most careful person she knew with information that needed to be kept until it needed to be heard." Carol looked at me. "George," she said, "I think your wife was smarter than either of us." Helen Park was 63 years old, small and precise, with the specific quality of someone who has spent her career being trusted with things that matter and who has never once violated that trust in a way she could not justify to herself. She met me in her office the morning after Carol called her, with a sealed envelope on the desk between us. She did not open the envelope. She simply placed her hands on either side of it and said, "Rose gave me this 18 months ago, with specific written instructions. I am going to read you those instructions before I open it." She read from a separate document. The instructions said, "This envelope is to remain sealed unless and until my children contest my will. If they contest it, this envelope is to be opened in the presence of my husband George Hadley and my personal attorney, and its contents are to be used as evidence in whatever legal proceeding results. If my children do not contest my will, this envelope is to be destroyed unopened on the 5th anniversary of my death. Helen set the instructions down. She looked at me. Your stepchildren filed a formal contest 4 months ago, she said. Yes, I said. She picked up the envelope. She opened it. Inside was a letter, handwritten, on the specific stationery Rose had used for personal correspondence, a heavy cream paper she had ordered from a specific supplier in England for 20 years. The handwriting was Rose's. The date was 18 months before her death, 6 months before she began her final decline. Helen read it aloud. I am going to tell you what it said, because what it said is the entire point of everything that follows. The letter began, in Rose's specific and precise voice. I am writing this letter because I know my children. I love them without illusions, which means I love them with full knowledge of who they are, and who they are includes the specific possibility that they will contest my will if they feel the terms do not serve their financial interests sufficiently. I am not writing this letter because I believe they are bad people. I am writing it because I believe they are people for whom money has become, at this stage of their lives, more important than the truth, and I want the truth to be available when they decide to prioritize money over it. The letter then described, in the specific and organized manner of a woman who had thought carefully about what needed to be established and in what order, the following. First, that Rose had been of entirely sound mind and full cognitive capacity at the time the will was executed, which had been 22 months before her death, well before the period of illness that Victor and Patricia would attempt to use as the basis for their capacity claim. She described her mental state at the time of execution with precision, including the specific conversations she had had with Helen Park about each provision of the will and her reasoning for each. Second, that the provisions of the will reflected her wishes as they had existed for many years, not as they had been shaped by any outside influence. She described a will she had written in 1997, 4 years before she met me, in which she had made similar provisions for the person she would eventually share her life with, whoever that person turned out to be, because she had always believed that the partner who shared the daily work of a life deserved the security of that life's material fruit, and that adult children who had been raised and educated and supported were not entitled to inherit the material fruit of a parent's later life at the expense of the partner who had shared it. Third, that she had made a deliberate decision not to tell me about the existence of this letter, because telling me would have made me complicit in a preparation that she wanted to be entirely her own. She said, and this is the part that Carol Webb would later tell me was the most legally significant passage in the document, George had no knowledge of this letter. He had no knowledge of my conversations with Helen Park. He had no knowledge of the specific provisions of my will beyond the general outline I shared with him as a spouse, which is the minimum that any honest partnership requires. Any claim that he influenced my decisions is a claim about a version of our marriage that does not exist and has never existed. He influenced me daily by being a person of consistent integrity and consistent love. This is not undue influence. This is a good marriage. Fourth, and finally, she said this, my children will tell a story about their stepfather that is not true. I know this because I know them, and I know that the story serves a purpose they have decided is worth pursuing. I want the record to reflect that the true story is this one. A man loved me honestly for 19 years, and I loved him back, and we built a life together that was entirely our own, and the provisions of my will reflect that life and that love, and nothing else. I made these choices freely, clearly, and with full understanding of their implications. I stand by them. And I am sorry that my children have decided to make this ugly, because I specifically asked George not to let them, and I am sorry to make that task harder for him by telling him this from where I am. He will understand. Helen Park finished reading. The room was very quiet. I sat with my hands flat on the desk, the way I sit when I am keeping myself steady, and I thought about Rose standing in a charity auction bidding against herself to get a painting to its minimum, and I thought about her voice on the last morning, and I thought about the fact that she had known, 18 months before she died, that this day would come, and she had prepared for it with exactly the care and exactness that she had brought to everything. She had given me what I needed. From 18 months before I needed it. That was Rose. While Carol waited for the letter to be formally entered into the legal proceedings, she had also been doing what she had promised to do, which was find out who Sandra Norris was and why she had made a false declaration about a woman she had never met. The investigator Carol used was a man named Thomas Briggs who had spent 15 years in insurance fraud investigation before transitioning to private practice, and who had, in Carol's assessment, an almost supernatural ability to find the specific financial thread that connected a false statement to the person who had paid for it. Thomas Briggs found the thread in 11 days. Sandra Norris was a woman who had a history of providing paid testimony in will contests. Not a long history, 3 previous instances, but a documented one, in 3 separate counties over 8 years, each time appearing as a witness to undue influence or cognitive impairment in contested estate proceedings. 2 of those cases had been dismissed when her testimony was challenged. 1 had succeeded, resulting in a will being partially overturned. In 2 of the 3 previous cases, the attorney who had coordinated her engagement as a witness was the same attorney who was now representing Victor and Patricia. Thomas Briggs also found the payment. It had been made from a business account registered to a consulting firm that, on examination, had no clients, no revenue, and no purpose except to serve as a conduit for payments that needed to be kept at a distance from their source. The business account was controlled by Victor Morrison. Victor had paid Sandra Norris $4,000 to provide a false declaration about events she had not witnessed, in a proceeding designed to overturn his mother's will, 6 months after his mother's death. Carol Webb placed this information on the conference table in front of me and said, "Do you want to understand what this means legally before I tell you what I'm going to do with it?" "Tell me what you're going to do with it," I said. "I'm going to present it to the judge the same morning we present Rose's letter," she said. "I want both pieces to land at the same time. The letter tells them who Rose was and what she wanted. The payment records tell them what Victor was willing to do to override what Rose wanted." She paused. "I have been doing this for 20 years, George. I have not often had a case where the deceased person was this far ahead of everyone around her." "She usually was," I said. The night before the hearing, I did not sit calmly in the living room thinking carefully about 19 years. I want to be honest about this, because I have told you throughout this story that I stayed composed, that I assessed and waited and did not panic, and all of that was true in the rooms where other people were watching. But in the room where no one was watching, the kitchen, 11 o'clock at night, the night before the hearing, the composure finally slipped. Not loudly. I am not a loud person and I was not loud about it. I simply sat at the kitchen table and felt, for the first time since the contest was filed, the full weight of everything that had been done. They had paid a woman to lie. They had paid someone to stand in front of a judge and describe events in my home that had never happened, involving a woman who was dying, at dates when that woman was at the hospital receiving treatment. They had taken the most vulnerable period of Rose's life and mine and they had used it as raw material for a fraud designed to strip away the last thing Rose had given me. And they had done it with her mother's face still on their walls. Before they auctioned it. I thought about Victor calling 3 weeks after the diagnosis. I thought about Patricia at the funeral, dry-eyed, checking her phone during the reception. I thought about the painting Victor had admired at 17, the one Rose had specifically left him because she remembered that specific admiration from 30 years earlier, sold at auction within 6 weeks. I thought about Rose in this kitchen, at this table, on 100 ordinary mornings, drinking coffee and reading the newspaper and occasionally saying something so precise about a situation or a person that I would still be thinking about it a week later. I thought about Rose knowing 18 months before she died that this was coming. Sitting with Helen Park in a law office and dictating the truth of our marriage because she understood that the truth would need a spokesperson after she was gone, and she was going to be that spokesperson herself. She had done all of that for me. She had carried all of that on top of a terminal diagnosis and 14 months of treatment and the specific grief of knowing she was leaving a life she had finally gotten right. She had done all of that and she had not told me, because she had not wanted the remaining time between us to feel like a preparation for something instead of the thing itself. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. And then, because I had no other option and because she had specifically told me not to let them make it ugly, I got up. I went to the cupboard and I got out the specific tea she had always made on the nights when something was heavy, a blend she had brought back from a trip we took years ago and that I had kept ordering since her death because it was the right thing to drink when things were difficult and she had known this. I made the tea. I sat back down. I drank it slowly. I looked at her photograph on the side table. The one from the first August vacation we ever took together, 2002, a year before we married. Rose at the edge of the ocean with her shoes in her hand, laughing at something I had said that I can no longer remember. She looked like a person who had survived something difficult and arrived, finally, somewhere she was glad to be. I am so glad she arrived here, I thought. I am so glad she picked me. I washed the cup. I dried it. I put it back where she always kept it. I went to bed. In the morning I put on my best suit, the one I wore for the most important meetings of my career. I tied my tie carefully. I drove to the courthouse. I sat at the table next to Carol Webb and I was ready. Patricia finished her testimony. Victor had not yet been called. Their attorney was preparing to introduce Sandra Norris as a witness. The judge, a woman named the Honorable Margaret Chen, who had the specific quality of judicial patience that comes from having seen every variety of family dispute available in a long career, was reviewing a document her clerk had just handed her. She set the document down. She looked at the attorneys. "Before we proceed with the next witness," she said, "I want to address something that has been submitted to this court this morning." She held up a folder. This submission includes a letter written by the decedent Rose Hadley, authenticated by her personal attorney Helen Park, who was present at its execution, dated 22 months before Mrs. Hadley's death. It also includes financial records documenting a payment made to the witness Sandra Norris from an account controlled by the petitioner Victor Morrison. She looked at Victor's attorney. "I will give you an opportunity to respond to these materials before we proceed. But I want you to understand that this court takes the submission of false testimony extremely seriously, and that the records before me are going to require a careful explanation." Victor's attorney stood up. He said something about objections and proper procedure and the authentication of documents. The judge listened. She nodded. She sustained none of the objections. Then Carol Webb stood up. She asked for permission to read a portion of Rose's letter into the record. Permission was granted. Carol read the section I have already shared with you. The part that began "My children will tell a story about their stepfather that is not true" and ended with "I am sorry that my children have decided to make this ugly." She read it clearly and without emotional performance, in the direct professional manner of a woman who understood that the words themselves were the performance and required nothing added. The courtroom was very quiet. I watched Victor's face during the reading. I watched the specific moment, and there was a specific moment, you could see it cross him like a cold front moving through, when he understood that his mother had anticipated exactly this. That she had sat in a room 18 months before she died and thought, "My children are going to do this, and I am going to answer them, and I am going to answer them in my own voice so that no one can say it is anyone else's interpretation." She had loved him enough to prepare for the worst version of him. He looked down at the table. He did not look up again for a long time. Patricia was perfectly still beside him, the stillness of a person whose arguments have just been answered by the last voice they expected to be answered by. She had come into that courtroom certain of her story. Rose had been influenced. Rose had not been well. Rose had not truly chosen this. These were the things Patricia had told herself, perhaps sincerely, across the months of building a legal case. And then the letter had been read aloud, and every sentence of it was in Rose's voice, saying, "I was well. I chose this. I knew exactly what I was doing. I know exactly what you are doing right now." The weight of being known that completely, being known and refuted by your own mother, from beyond her own death, sat in that courtroom like something physical. Carol finished reading. She sat down. The room remained quiet. Then the judge looked at Victor's attorney and said, simply, "Counsel, your response to the payment documentation." The attorney stood. He said words about authentication and procedure. The judge listened with the patience of a woman who has heard every variety of legal objection available and who knows which ones are substantive and which ones are delay. She sustained none of them. Victor's case did not collapse dramatically. It did not fall with a crash. It simply became, in the space of about 40 minutes of procedural conversation, a case that had no remaining ground to stand on, like a building whose foundation has been quietly removed while everyone was looking at the facade. The contest was dismissed. The judge's written ruling, which Carol received 3 weeks after the hearing, described Rose's letter as an unusually clear expression of the decedent's wishes and cognitive state, executed at a time well before the period of illness referenced in the petitioner's claims, and entirely consistent with the provisions of the will as executed. She also described the payment to Sandra Norris as deeply troubling and referred the matter to the county prosecutor's office for review of potential perjury charges. Victor and Patricia were ordered to pay court costs. Sandra Norris was subsequently charged with making a false declaration in a legal proceeding. The attorney who had coordinated her engagement faced a bar investigation. Victor faced, at minimum, a referral to the prosecutor's office regarding the payment. The specifics of those proceedings are ongoing and I will not detail what I do not know the full outcome of. Diane called me the evening after the ruling. She said, "I should have done more." I told her what I believed, which was that she had done what she could at the cost that was available to her, and that the cost had been real, and that I did not hold against her what she had not had the resources to give. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Mom would have said something more elegant than that. She would have, I agreed. She usually did. Diane asked if she could come to see me the following week. I told her yes. She came on a Saturday afternoon, and we sat in the living room where Rose's art was displayed, and she told me about the conversation she'd had with her siblings when they asked her to join the contest, and about what it had cost her to refuse, and about the specific quality of loneliness that comes from choosing the right thing over the familiar thing when the familiar thing is family. I listened to her the way Rose had always listened, with full attention and without the need to fill the silences with comfort before the silence had finished saying what it needed to say. Diane stayed for 3 hours. She asked about specific pieces in the art collection, their histories, where Rose had found them, what Rose had said about them. She was the only one of the 3 children who had ever asked these questions, which was exactly why Rose had left her the watercolor of the garden. I told her the stories behind every piece she asked about. Some of them were funny. Some of them were the specific kind of sad that sits alongside happiness rather than replacing it. Diane laughed at the funny ones and was quiet for the sad ones, in exactly the right measure. She has come back every month since. She brings her daughter sometimes, a 12-year-old who has Rose's eyes and who asked me, on her first visit, whether the lady in the photograph on the side table was really her grandmother, because she looked like she was laughing about something really good. I told her she was, and that she usually was laughing about something really good, and that if she ever wanted to hear some of the stories behind the laugh in that particular photograph I would be glad to tell her. She said yes immediately, with the specific eagerness of a 12-year-old who has decided that something is worth knowing and wants it right now. I told her the story. It took 20 minutes. She listened with her whole body, the way children listen when something has captured their full attention, and at the end she said, "That's a really good story." She was a really good person, I said. The 12-year-old looked at the photograph for a moment. Then she said, "I think she would have liked me." "I have no doubt," I said. "None at all." 8 months after the will contest was dismissed, I established the Rose Hadley Foundation. It was not a large foundation. I am not a wealthy man by the standards that the word wealthy is applied to, and I did not want to create something that required a scale I could not sustain. What I created was something small and specific and entirely consistent with who Rose was and what she had cared about. The foundation funded Tuesday evening volunteer programs at children's hospitals. Not endowments or capital campaigns or building names, just the specific, weekly, hands-on work of volunteers sitting with sick children on Tuesday evenings, because that was what Rose had done for 23 years and because the most direct way to honor a person is to continue the specific work they did rather than to build something impressive in their name. I serve on the foundation's board. Diane serves on the foundation's board. Diane's daughter volunteers on Tuesday evenings. It is a small thing. It is exactly the right size. I want to tell you what Rose left behind, beyond the material estate that the will contest sought to redirect. She left a letter that told the truth about her marriage and her choices and her knowledge of her own children, in the specific voice that I have been hearing in my memory every day for the past year and a half. She left it with a careful woman who knew when to open it and why. She left 3 children who will have to live with what 2 of them chose to do, and one of whom chose differently and who comes to see me every month with her daughter who has her grandmother's eyes. She left 19 years of the specific ordinary happiness that people who have been through difficult first chapters recognize as extraordinary. She left the house, which I am still in, and the art, which is still on the walls, and the Tuesday evening habit, which I have continued, going alone to charity auctions where I occasionally bid on paintings that are clearly not going to make their minimum, because it is the right thing to do and because it makes me feel, for the duration of the bidding, that she is standing next to me laughing about something really good. She left the letter. I have read it so many times I know it by heart. I will know it by heart for whatever time remains to me. And she left this, the knowledge that a person who loves you clearly and honestly, without illusions and without performance, is building something around you that you cannot fully see while you are inside it, and that what they are building will hold long after they are gone, will hold against whatever tries to knock it down, will hold in the specific way of things built from genuine materials by honest hands. She was the most careful person I have ever known with things that needed to be kept until they needed to be heard. She heard right. She kept it right. She handed it to the right people at the right moment. That is who she was. That is what she left. I will not let them make it ugly. I promised her. I haven't. I won't. I have been thinking, in the months since the hearing, about what it means that Rose wrote that letter 18 months before she died. 18 months. Long enough before the end that she was not writing from the specific clarity that sometimes appears at the end of things, but from the ordinary clarity of a woman who understood her life fully and had always understood it fully. She was not dying when she wrote it. She was living, and she was looking at what she had built and what threatened it and what needed to be preserved, and she was doing what she had always done, organizing the practical reality of the situation with precision and care and the specific absence of self-pity that had been the most consistent quality of her entire life. She had written it for me. She had written it knowing I would need it. She had written it knowing the specific shape of what Victor and Patricia would do, because she knew them clearly, and she had given me the precise tool to address the specific action she had predicted they would take. This is an extraordinary thing to do for a person you love. It is not a romantic gesture or a dramatic one. It is a practical one, which is the most profound form of love available to people who express love through action rather than declaration. Rose expressed love through action. Through 23 years of Tuesday evenings. Through the bid that went from $300 to $502 on a painting no one else wanted. Through 19 years of Sunday morning arguments and August vacations and the specific ordinary happiness that neither of us took for granted. And through a letter, written in her careful hand on her specific cream paper, placed in the keeping of a careful woman who knew when to open it and why, and addressed, in the deepest sense, to the question her children were going to ask, was this marriage real, and did it deserve what she left it? Yes. It was real. She said so. She said it clearly. She said it from 18 months before it needed to be said, because she was the most careful person I have ever known with the things that needed to be kept until they needed to be heard. I keep her photograph on the side table. I go to Tuesday evening auctions. I bid on the paintings that aren't going to make their minimum. She would have done exactly that, and I intend to keep doing it until I can't, and that is the truest form of fidelity I know how to offer. Don't let them make it ugly. I won't. She wrote the letter before she needed to. She left it where the right hands found it. True, she knew her children, knew the shape of greed, and gave her husband everything he'd need. The judge read every word aloud that day, and all the careful lies dissolved away. The court was quiet when the truth was known. A woman's love had built a wall of stone. So here's to every steady one who stayed, who kept their promises though the cost was paid, who sat beside a bed until the end and found their wife had been their truest friend. Not just in life but in the aftermath. She'd mapped for him the necessary path. The letter waited, patient, sealed, and sure. The love that wrote it was the love that's pure. A steady father doesn't need to shout when those who loved him clearly mapped it out. He simply trusts the truth and lets it stand, and holds his wife's last letter in his hand. Don't let them make it ugly. She had said. He kept that promise long after she was dead. The foundation runs on Tuesday evenings still, and Rose's letter proved her final will. I want to tell you about the phone call Victor made to me 7 days after the contest was dismissed, because it is the part of the story I have gone back to most often in the months since, and because what he said in it, and what I said back, is the most honest exchange we ever had in 22 years of knowing each other. He called on a Wednesday evening, which I noted because Rose had died on a Wednesday, and I had come to associate that day of the week with a specific quality of weight that I was still learning to carry without letting it change my stride. I almost did not answer. I looked at his name on the screen and I thought about not answering, and then I thought about Rose's letter and the line that said I love them without illusions, and I answered. Victor said, I want to talk to you. I said, I'm listening. There was a pause. In 22 years of knowing Victor, I had never heard him pause before speaking. He was a man who spoke fluently and continuously, and with the specific confidence of someone who has decided that thinking before speaking is an unnecessary delay. The pause was something I did not have a category for. Then he said, I didn't think she would have done that. I said, done what specifically? He said, written that letter. I didn't think she knew what we were going to do. I said, she knew you better than you knew yourself, Victor. She always did. Another pause. Longer this time. I didn't think she was angry at us, he said. She wasn't, I said. If she had been angry, the letter would have sounded different. She was clear-eyed. There's a difference. Victor was quiet for a moment. What does that mean? It means she loved you and she also saw you exactly as you were, I said. Those two things coexisted in her. They always did. The letter was not an act of anger. It was an act of preparation. She prepared because she knew what you were likely to do, and she wanted the truth to be available when you did it. That's not anger. That's your mother being your mother. The silence this time lasted long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then Victor said, I sold the painting. I know, I said. I shouldn't have, he said. I did not respond to this. It was accurate and it was too late, and acknowledging it felt like something that should belong to him rather than to a conversation between us. I'm sorry, Victor said. I thought about what Rose would have said. I thought about the specific way she responded to apologies, not dismissing them, not accepting them too readily, but holding them for the amount of time they deserved before saying what needed to be said. I hear you, I said. I'm not able to tell you that it didn't matter, because it did. But I hear you. He said, that's fair. He ended the call a few minutes later. I sat in the living room in the specific quiet of a house that has been inhabited by someone who is no longer in it, and I thought about the painting Victor had sold at auction, a landscape he had admired at 17, that Rose had specifically left him because she remembered him admiring it, that he had sold within 6 weeks of her death because he had decided it was worth more as money than as the specific evidence that his mother had remembered what he loved. He would have to live with that. I could not carry it for him and I would not try. But I thought, sitting there, that something in the call had been real. Not enough to undo what had been done. But real in the way that things are real when a person arrives, however late and however incompletely, at a moment of genuine reckoning with what they have chosen and what it has cost. Rose would have found the precise word for what I was feeling. She always did. I did not have it. I simply sat with it, and let it be what it was, and that was enough. I told you we met at a charity auction, but I did not tell you the full story of that evening, and the full story matters because it is the story Rose told when people asked how we had met, and the way she told it was different from the way I would have told it, and the difference between our two versions is the most accurate portrait of our marriage I know how to offer. My version, I saw a woman bidding against herself to get a painting to its minimum reserve and I made a remark about stubbornness and she turned around and had the most direct and unimpressed expression I had ever seen on a person at a charity event, and I asked her to dinner and she told me she needed to think about it and called me the next morning and said yes. Rose's version, a man came up to her while she was trying to help a painting that needed help and made an unhelpful remark about stubbornness, and she was going to ignore him entirely except that he said it in a tone that was teasing rather than critical, which was unusual, and so she turned around, and he looked slightly alarmed at having attracted her attention, which she found interesting because most men who said things at charity auctions were not alarmed by the results of those things. She finished bidding on the painting. He asked her to dinner. She said she needed to think about it because she genuinely needed to think about it, and when she had thought about it she called him and said yes because the alarm she had seen on his face when she turned around had seemed like evidence of a person who said things without being entirely certain of the outcome, which was not a quality she had encountered often enough. In her version, the alarm was the point. In my version, the stubbornness was the point. Both of us were right about the other person. This is the most honest description of a marriage I know how to give, two people who were each right about the other person's most important quality, from the very first night, and who spent 19 years discovering the further dimensions of what they had initially seen correctly. She had seen something in me on a first evening that I had not known was visible. I had seen something in her that she had known was visible and had decided was worth someone seeing. We had built from those two sightings everything that followed, including 19 years and a letter and a Tuesday evening foundation and a 12-year-old girl who has her grandmother's eyes and who thinks Rose would have liked her. She would have. I have no doubt at all. The house is on a street with large oak trees, in a neighborhood that was built in the 1970s when that particular style of residential architecture, broad setbacks, brick facades, deep yards, was the expression of a specific aspiration toward the permanent, toward the building of things meant to last. Rose and I bought it in 2003, 7 years before we had any reason to believe it would become the object of a legal dispute, in the simple manner of two people who had found the specific combination of space and light and neighborhood that suited the life they were building together. We had renovated the kitchen in 2007 and the master bathroom in 2012 and the back porch in 2016, each renovation a decision made together over kitchen table conversations that lasted longer than the renovations themselves and that produced, in the end, spaces that reflected both of us rather than either of us alone. The art is on the walls. The pieces that remain after the auction sales Victor and Patricia conducted, the pieces that were designated for them and that they treated as currency rather than inheritance, those are gone, and their absence is visible in the specific way of spaces that have held something and then been asked to hold its absence instead. The watercolor of the garden that Rose left to Diane is not in the house. It is in Diane's house, hung in a room that Diane described to me as the room where she does her thinking, which is where Rose always wanted it to go. Rose had said in the letter that she left the garden watercolor to Diane because Diane was the only one of the three who had ever asked where it came from, and that asking where something comes from is the beginning of understanding what it is, and that she had wanted someone to understand what that particular painting was. Diane understands it. She told me, on one of her monthly visits, what it had meant to her to receive it, not the financial value, which was modest, but the specific meaning of her mother having remembered a question she had asked about a painting, and having built that memory into a legal document that would survive both of them. She remembered things, Diane said. She remembered everything, I said. No, Diane said. Not everything. She remembered the things that mattered. That's different. Everybody remembers things. She remembered the ones that mattered. That is the most accurate description of Rose that anyone has offered me in the year and a half since her death. Diane had it exactly right. When the written ruling arrived from the court and Carol called to confirm its contents and to tell me that the referral to the prosecutor's office had been made, she said something at the end of the call that I have thought about many times since. She said, "I've handled a lot of will contests. I've seen forged documents, paid witnesses, fraudulent medical evaluations, manipulated signatures. I've seen the full range of what families do to each other over money. But I want to tell you that this case was unusual in a specific way." I asked her what way. "Most will contests," she said, "are fundamentally about the absence of the deceased person. The deceased person is not there to say what they wanted, and the contest is about competing interpretations of what they might have wanted, and the truth gets buried under competing narratives and the evidence is always incomplete and the outcome is always uncertain in a way that is uncomfortable." She paused. This case was different because Rose was there. Not literally. But the letter was Rose being present in the courtroom in the most complete way available to a person who is no longer alive. She had thought through exactly what would happen and exactly what needed to be said, and she had said it with more clarity and more specificity than most living witnesses achieve. The contest failed not because your attorney was skilled, which she was, or because the evidence of the payment was damning, which it was, but because the person being contested had already answered every question before the questions were asked. She paused again. "That's extraordinary. That doesn't happen. I want you to know it doesn't happen, and that what your wife did for you was extraordinary." I said I knew. She said she was glad. And she said goodbye, and the case was closed. Elena is 12 years old and she has Rose's eyes and she asks about 3 questions for every answer she receives, which is either exhausting or wonderful depending on the day, and which I have decided is wonderful on all days because the alternative to a curious child is an incurious one and the incurious children of the world are not my concern. She came with Diane on a Saturday in November and she brought a school project about family history, which required her to interview a family member about their memories of a specific period. She had chosen me as her interview subject without consulting her mother, which Diane told me afterward in a tone that indicated she had been presented with a fait accompli rather than consulted. Elena sat across from me with a notebook and a pencil and the specific focused expression of a 12-year-old who has decided that this interview is a serious matter and intends to conduct it accordingly. She asked me about my marriage to Rose. She asked what Rose had been like. She asked what I missed most. She asked whether I thought Rose had been happy. I answered all of these questions as honestly and as specifically as I could, because Elena was asking them genuinely and genuine questions deserve genuine answers. When I told her about the charity auction where Rose and I had met, she wrote it down in her notebook with the specific neatness of someone who has decided this detail is worth preserving exactly. When I told her about the letter, she stopped writing. She looked up at me. She said, "She wrote it 18 months before?" 18 months, I said. "That means she was thinking about you 18 months before she had to," she said. I had not thought about it in quite those terms. I sat with the formulation for a moment, because it was precisely right in a way that the more complex ways I had thought about it were not. "Yes," I said. "That's exactly right." Elena wrote this down too. She underlined it. At the end of the interview she asked me if Rose would have been a good interview subject. "Better than me," I said. "She would have given you exactly the right amount of detail and not a word more, and every detail would have been the precise one you needed, and you would have left feeling like you had understood something completely." Elena thought about this. "That sounds like a good way to be," she said. "It's the best way I know of," I said. She closed her notebook. She thanked me with the specific formality of a 12-year-old who has decided that gratitude, like the interview, should be conducted seriously. Then she went to find Diane, and I sat in the living room with the art on the walls and the photograph on the side table and the house around me that held everything it held, and I was exactly where I was supposed to be. That is the thing that was contested and that was not taken. The house, the art, the Tuesday evenings, the 12-year-old with the notebook and the grandmother's eyes. Rose left all of it to me. She knew I would know what it was worth. She was right. She was almost always right. I spent 32 years as an architect before I retired, and the specific quality of attention that profession requires, the ability to look at a space and understand simultaneously what it is, what it needs to be, and what stands between those two conditions, is the quality I have thought about most often in the context of my marriage to Rose and in the context of what followed her death. Architecture teaches you, among other things, that every structure has a foundation that is not visible from the outside and that the stability of what you can see is entirely determined by the integrity of what you cannot. You can have the most beautiful facade in the world sitting on a compromised foundation, and it will look perfect right up until the moment it does not, and then the fall is complete and not partial, because the thing that was holding it up was not real. Victor and Patricia had built a case on a foundation that was not real. The paid witness, the claims of cognitive impairment, the narrative of undue influence, all of it was facade, constructed with sufficient care to look convincing from the distance of a legal filing. What it did not have, what it could not have, was the foundation of actual truth, and when the actual truth was presented in the form of Rose's letter, the facade fell completely because there was nothing underneath it to hold anything up. I had spent 32 years understanding this principle in the context of buildings. I understood it, by the end of the will contest, in the context of families as well. Rose had built something real. Her marriage to me, her understanding of her children, her preparation of the letter, her 3 conversations with Helen Park, all of it was built on the foundation of honest attention to what was actually true rather than what would have been more comfortable to believe. The structure she had built held when it was tested, because the foundation was genuine, and genuine foundations are the only ones that actually hold. This is what I want to pass on, if I can pass on anything. Not the specific story of a will contest and a paid witness and a letter that arrived at exactly the right moment. But the principle underneath the story: build on what is true, even when what is true is difficult, because what is true is the only foundation that holds. Rose knew this. She had always known it. She had applied it to every element of her life with the consistency of someone who has chosen a principle and does not make exceptions to it because exceptions are where foundations crack. Build on what is true. Don't make exceptions. That is what Rose left me, beyond the letter and the house and the Tuesday evenings. That is what I am trying to honor. Carol Webb found it during the discovery process, and when she told me about it I had to sit down, because the implication of it was something I had not fully considered even in the context of everything else that had been revealed. In 1997, for years before she met me, Rose had executed a will. She had been 43 years old, recently divorced from her first husband, raising 3 teenagers largely alone, and she had sat down with an attorney and made decisions about what she wanted to happen to her estate in the event of her death. The 1997 will left the bulk of her estate, the house she owned then, her investment accounts, her savings, not to her children, but to the person who shares my daily life at the time of my death, in recognition of the fact that shared daily life is the truest form of partnership available to human beings and deserves to be honored as such. Her children received specific bequests, amounts that reflected what she had assessed as their genuine needs rather than a general division of the estate. The will had never been used. Rose had updated it multiple times over the years, eventually arriving at the version that named me specifically as the person who shared her daily life, with the same underlying philosophy but with the specificity that a named individual provides over a general description. But the 1997 will existed in the public record, and Carol located it, and the implication was this: Rose's decision to leave the majority of her estate to the person who shared her daily life was not a decision she had made under my influence. It was a decision she had made 4 years before she knew I existed, as the expression of a philosophy she had held about marriage and partnership that had been consistent across the entire span of her adult life. The petitioners had claimed that I had influenced Rose to change her will in my favor. The 1997 will demonstrated that the provisions of the final will were not a change, they were a continuation. The philosophy had been hers long before I arrived to benefit from it. Carol presented this to the court alongside Rose's letter, and the judge's written ruling specifically cited the 1997 will as corroborating evidence of the consistency of Rose's testamentary intent across time. I had not known about the 1997 will until Carol found it. Rose had not told me. She had not told me for the same reason she had not told me about the letter, because telling me would have changed the specific quality of what we had, which was a marriage in which the financial dimensions were not the primary thing and in which she had not wanted me to know that I was the beneficiary of decisions she had made before I was in her life. She had loved me before she met me, in the sense that the person she had decided she would love, whoever that person turned out to be, was a person of the kind I was, and she had made legal provision for that person's security before she knew his name. I sat with this for a long time after Carol told me. I sat with the specific quality of being known by someone in a way you did not know you were known, which is one of the most disorienting and most moving experiences available in a human life. She had decided, in 1997, that whoever she eventually shared her daily life with deserved the security of what she had built. Then she had met me and spent 19 years building it together with me, and at the end she had looked at what we had made and confirmed that it was exactly the thing she had been describing in 1997, and left it accordingly. I do not have an adequate word for what it means to be the person a decision like that was waiting for. I am not certain an adequate word exists. But I know what it felt like, sitting in Carol's office while she explained the implications of the 1997 will, and what it felt like was the specific warmth of being understood completely by someone who is no longer there to be thanked for the understanding. The art on the walls of our house, the pieces that Victor and Patricia were not designated and did not take, constitute a record of 23 years of Tuesday evening charity auctions that I have been trying, since Rose's death, to understand as fully as she understood it. Each piece has a story. Rose knew every story. She kept them in a notebook, a small gray notebook that I found in her desk drawer 3 weeks after she died, organized by acquisition date, with each piece described by its physical properties, its provenance as far as she knew it, the specific auction at which it was acquired, the amount bid, and a brief note about what had drawn her to it. The note about the first piece, a small oil landscape she had acquired in 1994 before we met, reads, "Bid too high." But it was the only honest landscape in the room. The note about the painting we acquired at the auction where we met, the one I had watched her bid on against herself, reads, "George bid on my behalf at the end because he felt guilty about his earlier remark. I let him because it was the right painting and his money was as good as mine. He was alarmed when I found out." This was informative. I read that note standing in her study, holding the little gray notebook, and I laughed. A real laugh, alone in the house, the first one I had produced in the weeks since she died. She had let me contribute to the winning bid and had been watching the entire time and had filed it in her notebook as informative. That was Rose. That was entirely Rose. The notebook has 51 entries. I have read all of them. I have spent the past year and a half, on Sunday evenings, going through them one at a time, looking at the painting each entry describes and then reading what she had written about it, and I have come to understand the collection, through this process, as a kind of autobiography, not a deliberate one, not constructed for an audience, but the accidental autobiography of a woman's attention across 23 years, the record of what she had looked at and found honest and decided to bring home. She had always said the best art was honest. She meant it literally, not that the subject matter was factual or realistic, but that the work had been made with genuine intention rather than with the intention to please or to impress, and that genuine intention was visible in the work in a way she found impossible to fully articulate but entirely reliable to feel. She could walk into a room full of art and identify the honest pieces in under a minute. She had done this at every auction I had attended with her, pointing quietly at the things worth looking at and steering around the things that were well made without being true. I had never fully developed this capacity myself, though 19 years of exposure had given me a version of it that I could apply to buildings if not to paintings. The honest paintings are on my walls. The ones she chose because they were made with genuine intention are the ones that stayed, and the ones that stayed are the record of who she was and what she paid attention to and what she believed was worth keeping. I look at them every morning. They are the clearest version of her that remains in this house, clearer than the photographs, because they are not representations of her but the direct product of her attention, the things she saw and decided were true. That is what she left on the walls. That is what is still there. Thomas Briggs, the investigator Carol had hired to find the thread connecting the payment to Sandra Norris, came to my house 6 months after the case concluded. He said he had been thinking about something and wanted to tell me directly rather than through Carol. He sat in the kitchen, he declined the living room, said he was more comfortable in kitchens, and he held a cup of coffee with both hands and said, "I want to tell you something about Victor." I said, "Go ahead." He said, "In my experience, the people who do what Victor did, pay someone to make a false statement in a legal proceeding about a deceased parent, are almost never primarily motivated by money. I know it looks like money. The will is about money, the contest is about money, the payment to the witness involves money. But in my experience, what they're actually doing is fighting about something that the money represents." I said, "What do you think it represented for Victor?" He thought about this for a moment. Being chosen, he said. Your wife's will said, in effect, that the life she had with you was worth more to her than the inheritance claims of adult children who had been provided for. Victor experienced that as rejection. The contest was not really about the money. It was about the fact that his mother had made a choice and the choice had not been him. I sat with this for a while. He sold the painting, I said. I know, Thomas said. That's consistent with what I'm saying, actually. He received the painting and he sold it because receiving it didn't address the thing he was actually angry about, and so the painting had no value to him beyond what it could be converted into. Rose knew this, I said. She knew all of this. She knew it and she loved him anyway, Thomas said. And she prepared for it anyway. Those two things coexisted in her. I thought about her note in the small gray notebook. The only honest landscape in the room. The landscape she had bought in 1994, years before the children had become the people they became, years before the money was ever the point. She had always been looking for the honest thing in the room. She had found it in the paintings and she had found it in me, and she had prepared for the dishonest things with the precision of someone who understood the full landscape and refused to pretend any part of it was not there. Thomas finished his coffee. He said, "You had a remarkable wife." I know, I said. I knew it while she was here. That's the specific gift, knowing it at the time rather than only in retrospect. He nodded. He shook my hand. He left. I went to the living room and I looked at the paintings for a while, and then I went to the kitchen and I made dinner, and the house was warm, and the Tuesday evening auction was the following week, and everything that needed to be done was being done. 1 year after the contest was dismissed, I attended the annual gala of the Children's Hospital where Rose had volunteered for 23 Tuesday evenings per year. It was a charity auction. The room was full of paintings. I stood near the back, with a glass of sparkling water, and I did what Rose had taught me. I looked at the room and tried to identify the honest paintings. The ones made with genuine intention rather than the intention to please or impress. I found 3. One was a small watercolor landscape that nobody was bidding on because the opening bid was too high for what most people assumed it was worth. One was a large oil that was already the subject of competitive bidding from people who recognized it. One was a drawing, a pencil study, barely framed, that had been set near the door where most people passed it without slowing. I bid on the watercolor landscape. I bid on the pencil study. I let the oil go to the people who wanted it and could afford it. I won both of my bids. The watercolor came in just above its minimum reserve, which is the way Rose's bids usually came in. The pencil study came in $40 above its opening, because I was the only one bidding, and $40 above opening felt like the right amount. I brought them home. I found the places on the wall where they belonged, which took some rearrangement and some time with a level. I made notes in the gray notebook: acquisition date, provenance, amount bid, why I had chosen them. The note for the watercolor reads, "Looked like the only honest landscape in the room. Rose would have bid on it. Bid on her behalf." The note for the pencil study reads, "Nobody stopped to look at it." This seemed like sufficient reason. That is what I know how to do now, alone, in the house on the street with the oak trees, with the paintings on the walls and the small gray notebook in the desk drawer. I go to Tuesday evening auctions. I look for the honest thing in the room. I bid on it. Don't let them make it ugly. I haven't. She would know. The Rose Hadley Foundation completed its first year of operation in the spring, and Diane and I attended a small gathering at the Children's Hospital to mark the occasion with the foundation's board and the volunteer coordinators who had been running the Tuesday evening programs. There were 12 volunteers in the program's first year. The hospital had matched the foundation's funding with a small budget for materials. The programs had served, across the year, approximately 340 children in the pediatric and oncology wards. I stood at the front of the small conference room where the gathering was held, looking at the 12 volunteers, all ages, all backgrounds, all of them there because they had responded to a Tuesday evening call for people who were willing to simply show up and be present with children who needed people to show up and be present, and I said, briefly, that the foundation was named for a woman who had understood, through 23 years of doing this work herself, that showing up on a Tuesday evening was not a large gesture but that it was a true one, and that true gestures accumulate into something more durable than large gestures, and that the 340 children who had been visited this year were the evidence of that accumulation. Diane was in the back of the room. She was crying, quietly, in the way she had learned from Rose, without drawing attention to it, without making it into something others needed to respond to, simply allowing herself to feel what she was feeling in the appropriate measure. Elena was beside her, not crying but paying attention with her whole body, the way she paid attention to things that mattered. After the gathering, Elena came to stand beside me as I looked at a display the hospital had put together of photographs from the first year of the program, Volunteers with Children, in the wards, on Tuesday evenings. She pointed at a photograph of a young woman sitting with a child who was probably 7 or 8 years old, both of them looking at a book together with the specific quality of shared absorbed attention that reading with a child produces. "That's what Grandma Rose did," she said. "Not the looking at the book specifically. The being there like that. Where the person you're with is the whole thing." "Yes," I said. "That's exactly what she did." Elena looked at the photograph for another moment. Then she said, "I want to do that." "Tuesday evenings," I said. "Starting whenever you want." She started the following Tuesday. That is what Rose left. That is what is still growing from what she left. Don't let them make it ugly. She built something true. I am trying to keep it true. The 12-year-old, 13 now, shows up on Tuesday evenings and sits with children who need someone to show up, and the foundation carries her grandmother's name, and the paintings are on the walls, and the small gray notebook is in the desk drawer, and the house is on the street with the oak trees, and on Wednesday mornings, which is the day Rose died and which I have come to associate with a specific quality of weight and of gratitude simultaneously, I make coffee in the kitchen and I sit at the table and I let the morning be what it is. It is enough. It is, in fact, everything. Sandra Norris's declaration was 4 pages long and written in the specific language of someone who has been coached on what to say without being given quite enough coaching to make it sound entirely natural. It described her as a private nursing aide who had been engaged by the Hadley family, she did not specify which member, to provide supplementary care to Rose Hadley during the final 3 months of her illness. It described the house in sufficient general detail to be consistent with the publicly available property records but in insufficient specific detail to indicate actual familiarity with the space. It described me as attentive to Rose in a way that she characterized as controlling rather than caring, using phrases that were clearly drawn from a template of undue influence testimony rather than from direct observation. The specific incident she described, the one that formed the centerpiece of her declaration, was a scene in which she claimed to have overheard me speaking to Rose in an insistent and repetitive manner about the will, specifically asking Rose to confirm, on multiple occasions, that the provisions were as she wanted them. She described Rose as appearing distressed and physically weakened during this exchange, and herself as having been uncertain whether to intervene. The scene had not happened. But its description was specific enough to be convincing to someone who had not been present, and vague enough in its specifics, no dates, no exact wording, no other witnesses identified, to be difficult to disprove directly without affirmative evidence of what the actual circumstances had been. This is why Carol had said, the first time she read it, that Rose's letter was the answer. Because Rose's letter was not simply a denial of what Sandra Norris had described. It was an affirmative account, written 18 months before the declaration was made, of the actual character of our marriage and the actual circumstances of Rose's decision-making. The letter did not address Sandra Norris's specific claims because Rose had not anticipated Sandra Norris specifically. It addressed the underlying question, had George influenced Rose? With the completeness and specificity of a woman who had been thinking about this question long before anyone asked it in a legal context. The letter was not a rebuttal. It was a prior truth that made the declaration irrelevant. Thomas Briggs, when he found the payment from Victor's account to Sandra Norris, had also found something else. He had found that Sandra Norris had, in the period immediately preceding her engagement by Victor's attorney, been facing a significant personal financial difficulty, a debt she had incurred in connection with a failed business venture that had left her in a position where $4,000 represented a meaningful relief of immediate pressure. This was not an excuse. But it was the human context of what had happened. A woman in financial difficulty had been offered money to provide testimony that she knew to be false, in a proceeding that was too distant from her daily life to feel immediately real, for a client she would never meet. She had said yes. The consequences had followed. Thomas had, in the course of his investigation, spoken to Sandra Norris directly. She had initially denied everything. Then, when he presented her with the documentation of the payment, she had been quiet for a long time and had then said, simply, "I didn't think it would go this far." This is the specific phrase of a person who has made a decision they knew was wrong and had justified to themselves on the grounds that the consequences would remain abstract. When the consequences become concrete, a fraud referral, a perjury charge, a public court ruling, the abstraction collapses and what remains is the simple truth of what was done and why. She had not thought it would go this far. It had gone this far. I do not take satisfaction in Sandra Norris's consequences. She was a person who made a wrong choice for comprehensible reasons and who is now living with the consequences of that choice, which is the appropriate outcome and also not a pleasant one to contemplate. What I do take, not satisfaction exactly but something in that territory, is this: the wrong choice did not prevail. The truth was already in place before the wrong choice was made, and the truth was sufficient to defeat it. Rose had made sure of that. 18 months before anyone needed her to. Helen Park described to me, after the hearing, the 3 conversations Rose had conducted with her in the 18 months before her death. The first conversation, which occurred 2 weeks after Rose's cancer diagnosis, was a practical one. Rose had arrived at Helen's office with a list of questions about the legal implications of the will in its current form and what would need to be updated given the new information about her health timeline. They had reviewed the will together, and Rose had confirmed that she wanted no material changes to its provisions, only an update to certain executory details. At the end of that first conversation, Rose had said, "I want to ask you something that isn't about the will directly." Helen had said, "Of course." Rose had said, "If my children contest this after I die, what happens?" Helen had explained the will contest process, the legal standards, the typical claims, the evidentiary requirements. Rose had listened without interrupting. Then she had asked 2 questions. She had asked what kind of evidence was most effective in defeating a contest based on undue influence. And she had asked how long the preparation of such evidence might take. Helen had explained that the most effective evidence in undue influence cases was direct testimony from the person alleged to have been influenced, as close to contemporaneous as possible, expressing their own understanding of their choices and motivations. She had explained that such testimony, if provided through an affidavit or letter executed at a time clearly predating the period of alleged influence, would be given significant weight. Rose had said, "Then let's make an appointment for next week." The second conversation, which was the one in which the letter was written, had lasted 2 hours. Helen had advised on what needed to be established and in what order. Rose had written in Helen's presence, consulting with Helen on specific phrasing, in the manner of a client who knows what she wants to say and wants to say it in the form most useful to the purpose. When the letter was finished, Rose had read it aloud entirely, to confirm that it said what she intended. Then she had sealed it herself and handed it to Helen with the written instructions specifying when it was to be opened. The third conversation had occurred 4 months before Rose's death, during a period of relative stability in her illness, and had been brief. Rose had come to confirm that Helen still had the letter and that she understood the instructions. Helen had confirmed both. Rose had thanked her and said, "I hope you never need to open it." Helen had said she hoped so too. Helen told me this story in the specific factual manner of an attorney reporting on conversations that were no longer protected by privilege, and when she finished she said, "She was one of the most deliberate clients I have ever had. She knew exactly what she needed and she went about getting it exactly. There was no excess. No hesitation. No second guessing." "That was Rose," I said. "I know," Helen said. "I worked with her for 22 years. In 22 years, I never saw her make a decision she hadn't thought through completely." "Did she ever seem frightened?" I asked. Helen considered this. "At the second conversation," she said slowly. "When she read the letter aloud, at the end. For just a moment. I think it was the moment she fully understood what she had prepared for and what it meant that she had needed to prepare for it. She was quiet for a few seconds. Then she sealed the envelope. She paused. She didn't let it change anything. She just felt it for a moment, and then she continued. That is the truest portrait of Rose I have been given by anyone who knew her outside our marriage. She felt things fully and then she continued. She did not let the feeling change the course. She did not pretend the feeling was not real. She felt it for a moment, and then she continued. That is what I am trying to do. Feel it fully. Then continue. People ask me sometimes whether I have thought about moving. The house is large for one person. The neighborhood is quieter than it was when we bought it. Several families with young children have moved away, and the specific noise of a neighborhood with children in it has been replaced by the different sound of a neighborhood that is aging in place. I have thought about moving. I have thought about it in the way that I think about most significant decisions, systematically, considering the full range of implications rather than the surface ones. And I have decided, each time I think about it, to stay. The reasons are practical and the reasons are not practical, and the not practical reasons are the ones that actually determine the decision, which I acknowledge without apology because the not practical reasons are real. The house contains 23 years of Tuesday evening charity auctions arranged on its walls. It contains the kitchen where Rose made coffee on the mornings I was trying to remember something and needed quiet to do it. It contains the back porch where we sat on summer evenings and talked about everything that did not need to be decided and let it go without deciding it. It contains the specific quality of a space that has been inhabited by two people for 20 years in the full sense of inhabitation, not merely occupied, but made into the expression of the specific life lived inside it. I am not going to leave that. I do not need to leave that. I am 70 years old and the house is paid for and it is mine, and it is exactly the right size for a person who has Diane coming every month and Elena on Tuesday evenings and the Tuesday evening auction on the week after and the small gray notebook in the desk drawer and the photographs on the side table. It is exactly the right size. I am staying. 6 months ago, at a Tuesday evening auction, I found a painting I had not expected to find. It was a small oil, approximately 12 by 16 inches, depicting a woman at a table near a window with a cup of something, coffee or tea, you could not tell which, in her hand, and a quality of absorbed, quiet attention on her face that indicated she was thinking about something specific without looking at anything in particular. The woman in the painting was not Rose. She was a different age and a different type, and the room around her was not any room I recognized. But the quality of her attention, the specific inward focus of a person who is fully present in their own thought without being absent from the world around them, was the quality I had watched in Rose for 19 years. I bid on it. I won it. I brought it home and I found a place for it on the wall near the window in the living room, where the morning light comes through at the specific angle that reveals the painting's full depth of color, and I looked at it for a long time. Then I opened the small gray notebook and I made an entry. The note reads, "A woman at a table, thinking. Bought it because of the attention. Not her. But the same quality. If you are reading this and you are not me, know that I was thinking of Rose when I bought it, and that thinking of Rose is one of the most consistent activities of my daily life, and that I have found no reason to do less of it as time passes and every reason to do more. I do not know who will read the notebook after me. Perhaps no one. Perhaps Elena, who has shown an interest in the paintings and who has the kind of mind that would find the notes worth reading. If she reads it, she will know what the entry means. If she does not read it, the entry is still true. Rose is the quality of attention. The steady, deliberate, honest attention to what is actually in the room, the honest landscape, the overpainted still life, the thing that was made with genuine intention rather than the intention to please. She taught me to see it. I am still seeing it. I intend to keep seeing it until I cannot. That is enough. That is the whole of it. There was a Tuesday, 3 months after the ruling, when I was driving home from a charity auction and I understood something I had been approaching from different angles for months without quite arriving at directly. I had been thinking about what Victor had said on the phone, that he hadn't thought Rose would have done that, written the letter. And I had been thinking about what Thomas Briggs had said about the contest being fundamentally about being chosen rather than about money. And I had been thinking about Rose's note in the gray notebook about the first painting she had ever bought, the only honest landscape in the room, and about what it meant that she had applied the same standard to people as to paintings. What I understood, driving home on a Tuesday evening after an auction, was this: Rose had not written the letter because she didn't trust me to handle the situation on my own. She had written it because she understood, with the specific clarity she brought to everything, that there was a version of the fight I could not win on my own. Not because I was not capable, but because the fight was fundamentally about her, about what she had wanted, what she had chosen, what she had known and understood and decided, and the only person who could speak to that with complete authority was Rose herself. The letter was not preparation for my failure. It was the extension of her own participation into a proceeding she could not attend. She had been in that courtroom. Not literally. But the letter was her voice, her clarity, her specific and organized account of her own mind and her own choices, and it had the authority of a person speaking for themselves rather than the lesser authority of a person speaking on behalf of someone else. I could have testified about Rose's wishes and her state of mind and the character of our marriage. Victor's attorney would have characterized that testimony as self-interested and partial and produced in service of my own financial benefit. The judge would have weighed it accordingly. Rose's testimony, delivered through the letter, was not subject to that characterization. She was speaking for herself, about herself, from a time before the contest had been filed and before the financial stakes had been established in the legal record. Her voice, preserved in that letter, was the one voice in the courtroom that had no interest in the outcome except the interest of saying what was true. That is why the letter worked. Not because it was eloquent, though it was. Not because it was legally precise, though Carol found it so. But because it was Rose's own voice, speaking her own truth, in her own specific and organized way, and the judge could hear the difference between that and everything else that had been said in the courtroom that day. I pulled into the driveway and sat in the car for a moment after I turned off the engine, thinking about this. She had given me her voice. That was the gift. Not a legal document, not a piece of evidence, not a strategic preparation. Her voice, preserved and delivered at the moment it was needed most, saying the things she would have said if she had been able to stand in that courtroom and speak for herself. I went inside and I made dinner and I sat at the kitchen table and I listened to the house, which has the specific quality of a house that has been inhabited by someone who is no longer in it, the particular silence that is full of the ghost of sound rather than empty of sound entirely. I could hear her in it. I always could. That was the gift that the letter had made visible, but that had been present long before the letter, the specific way that a person who has genuinely inhabited a space leaves something of themselves in it that does not evaporate when they leave. She was in the house. She was in the paintings. She was in the notebook. She was in the letter that had sat sealed in Helen Park's filing cabinet for 18 months before the moment it was needed. She had not left. She had simply changed the form in which she was present. I ate my dinner. I washed the dishes. I went to bed. In the morning it was Wednesday, and I made coffee, and I sat at the table, and the morning was full of what it was full of, and I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Diane Morrison, she had taken her mother's surname back after her own divorce, 2 years before Rose's death, told me her version of the conversation with Victor on the day he called to ask her to join the contest. She had been at her kitchen table, she said, when he called. Her daughter Elena had been doing homework at the other end of the table, and Diane had stepped into the next room when she understood what the call was about, because Elena was 12 years old and the conversation was not a 12-year-old's conversation. Victor had been organized and persuasive. He had explained the legal theory, the capacity claim, the undue influence claim, in the language of someone who had been well briefed by his attorney. He had made the financial case. The estate was significant. Rose's intentions had been shaped by a second marriage rather than by her children's long-term relationship with her. The legal mechanism existed to address exactly this kind of situation. Then he had said, she was our mother, Diane. Not his. Diane had been quiet for a moment. Then she had said, she was his wife, Victor. For 19 years. Victor had said, that's not the point. Diane had said, that is entirely the point. They had gone back and forth for 20 minutes, Victor making the financial and legal arguments, Diane making the personal and moral ones, and at the end of 20 minutes Diane had said, I'm not doing this, Victor. I loved Mom and I'm not going to stand in a courtroom and say things about her marriage that aren't true. Victor had said, you don't know they aren't true. Diane had said, I do know. I was there. I spent time in that house. I watched them together. It was a real marriage, Victor. You would know that too if you had visited more. The call had ended without resolution. Patricia had called the following day and made the same arguments with a different emotional register, less organized than Victor, more pleading, invoking their shared childhood and the difficulty of watching their mother's estate go to someone who wasn't really family. Diane had said, he was her family. He was the family she chose. Patricia had not called again. Diane told me this story on one of her monthly visits, and when she finished she said, I want you to know that I didn't do it because I thought you were right and they were wrong, necessarily. I did it because I knew Mom. And I knew that if Mom had wanted something different, she would have made sure something different happened. And she hadn't. So whatever she had set up was what she wanted. And I wasn't going to stand in the way of what she wanted. That's very precisely right, I said. That's how Mom thought, she said. I learned it from her. She had. She had learned it in the way that children learn the things that matter from parents, not through instruction but through observation, through the long accumulation of watching a person do things in a specific way and understanding, gradually, that the way has a logic and the logic is worth applying. Rose had applied honesty without exception for as long as Diane had known her. Diane had learned to apply it too, even when applying it was costly. The cost, in this case, had been 2 siblings who had not spoken to her since the ruling, and a family relationship that had been fractured by the choice she had made. She carried this with the specific combination of sorrow and steadiness that I recognized as entirely Rose's. She would be proud of you, I told her. Diane looked at the painting on the wall, the coastal print that Patricia had auctioned, no longer there, its absence a small rectangular gap in the arrangement that I had not yet filled. "I hope so," she said. "I mostly just hope I'm doing it right." "You are," I said. She nodded, in the way of someone who has accepted a reassurance they needed and will apply it carefully rather than carelessly. "That is Diane. That is what Rose left in Diane." I want to share one more entry from the gray notebook, the last entry that Rose made, which is dated 6 weeks before her death and which is the shortest entry in the book. The entry reads, "Bought nothing tonight. Went anyway. The paintings were not honest this month. Sat with George in the parking lot for 20 minutes after and talked about the harbor project he's consulting on. He still gets excited about good architecture the way he did 30 years ago. This is one of the things I love most about him. Going home. That is all it says. Bought nothing tonight. Went anyway. Going home." She went to the auction even when there was nothing to buy, because the Tuesday evening habit was not contingent on its outcome. She noted that I still got excited about good architecture, because noticing the things she loved about me had always been something she did consciously rather than casually. Going home. Those 2 words at the end of the last entry she ever made in the gray notebook are the words I return to most often. Not because they are dramatic. Because they are so entirely not dramatic. Because she went to a charity auction on a Tuesday evening 6 weeks before she died and found nothing worth bidding on and sat in the parking lot with me for 20 minutes talking about architecture and went home, and that was the evening, and it was enough, and she knew it was enough and wrote it down. Going home. That is the whole of what I am trying to say. That is the whole of what this story is about. Not the will contest and not the letter and not the paid witness and not the ruling. Those things are real and they happened and they are part of the story. But the whole of the story is, 2 people went to a charity auction on Tuesday evenings for 19 years, and sometimes they bought things and sometimes they didn't, and they sat in parking lots and talked about architecture, and they went home. Going home. Together. For 19 years. And then she was gone, and I went home alone, and the house held everything she had left in it, and I have been going home to it every night since. That is the steady thing. That is what holds. That is the steady father. The judge's written ruling was 14 pages long and Carol walked me through it paragraph by paragraph on the afternoon it arrived. Most of it was legal language, standard judicial prose that established the evidentiary basis for the dismissal, cited the relevant precedents for the authentication and weight of Rose's letter, addressed the implications of the payment to Sandra Norris. But there were 2 passages that were not standard. 2 passages where the judge stepped outside the formal language of a ruling and said something that belonged to her as a person rather than as a jurist. The first passage said, "The court notes that the letter produced by the decedent Rose Hadley demonstrates an unusual degree of foresight and clarity regarding the likely actions of the petitioners following her death. The decedent appears to have understood, with remarkable specificity, both the claims that would be made and the form of evidence most suited to addressing those claims, and to have prepared accordingly. This preparation, made at a time when the decedent was in full cognitive capacity and well before the period of illness referenced in the petitioner's claims, speaks powerfully to the quality of mind that the petitioner's claim was compromised." The second passage said, "It is the considered view of this court that the will as executed reflects the genuine, considered, and freely made wishes of Rose Hadley, as expressed consistently across more than 2 decades of estate planning and confirmed in her own voice in the letter entered into evidence. The provisions of the will shall be upheld in their entirety." Carol read these passages to me and then she set the ruling down and said, 14 pages and those are the only 2 paragraphs where she said what she actually thought. "What did she think?" I asked. "She thought Rose was extraordinary," Carol said. "And she thought the petitioners should be ashamed of themselves." She paused. She didn't say the second part. But the first part she said. Rose was extraordinary. The judge had understood this from a letter. I had understood it from 19 years. The difference in how we came to the understanding was significant. The understanding itself was the same. The Tuesday evening 3 weeks after the ruling was the first Tuesday I had attended the charity auction since Rose died. I had not been able to go in the 14 months between her death and the hearing. The habit had been so entirely ours, the 2 of us, the Tuesday evening, the parking lot conversation on the drive home, that going alone had felt, in the early months, like the specific wrong move of a person trying to maintain a form while the substance that gave the form meaning was no longer present. But 3 weeks after the ruling, I went. The auction was at the Children's Hospital where Rose had volunteered. I arrived at 7, which was the time we had always arrived, and I took a glass of sparkling water from the tray at the entrance and I walked into the main room and I looked at the paintings. I found 3 that were honest. One was a watercolor of a harbor that had the specific quality of having been painted by someone who had actually looked at the harbor rather than painted an idea of a harbor. One was an oil of a figure walking in winterlight that had the feeling of having been felt rather than observed. One was a small drawing, nearly hidden near the entrance, that was the kind of thing Rose would have stopped in front of for a long time. I bid on the watercolor and the drawing. The oil went to someone else, which was fine. It was the right price for someone who loved it, and I did not love it quite enough to go to that price. I won the watercolor. I won the drawing at its opening bid plus $20. I brought them home. I found their places on the wall. I made notes in the gray notebook. Then I sat in the living room for a while, in the specific quiet of the house on a Tuesday evening, with the new paintings on the wall and the old ones around them, and I thought about Rose standing at this same auction for 23 years, bidding on things that were honest, winning some, losing some, sitting in the parking lot afterward to talk about what we had seen. She had done this for 23 years and then she had not done it and then I had done it alone and the paintings were on the wall and they were honest and she would have approved of both of them and I would never be able to tell her so. That is the specific grief of the Tuesday evenings. Not the absence of her, I have learned to carry the absence. But the specific inability to tell her the things I would have told her on the drive home. The watercolor was of a harbor she would have loved. The drawing had the quality she described as being made from feeling rather than observation. I know exactly what she would have said about both of them. I will never be able to hear her say it. This is what I carry, every Tuesday evening, alongside the paintings I bring home. I carry the conversation that did not happen and cannot happen, the specific words in her specific voice that I can imagine with precision and that I will never actually hear. It is enough that I can imagine them. It has to be enough. It is. I want to tell you about the buildings I designed in 32 years of practice, not as a catalog of professional achievement but as the truest portrait available of a person who makes things for a living. A building is an argument. Every building argues something about what a space should be, how people should move through it, what it should feel like to be inside it. The argument is made through dimensions and materials and the specific quality of light that the building's orientation and fenestration produce at different times of day. The buildings I am proudest of are the ones in which the argument is honest. Not the ones that won awards, though some of those are also honest. The ones that, when you stand inside them, feel like they are exactly what they were meant to be, nothing more and nothing less, built from genuine understanding of what the space needed to do and designed to do it completely. I designed a library for a small city that I think about most often. It was not a large commission. It was a branch library in a neighborhood that had needed one for 20 years, and the budget was not generous and the site was not ideal and the program was not ambitious. What I gave them was a building in which the specific placement of the windows produced, on every weekday afternoon from 2 to 5, a quality of light in the children's section that made reading feel like the most natural activity available. Not a dramatic quality of light, not theatrical or ostentatious. Simply the right quality. The quality that a child sitting with a book in that room would not consciously notice but that would make the sitting and the book and the afternoon feel complete. I did not tell this to the client. The light was not in the program. I did it because it was what the space needed and because I was the person deciding what the space needed and I decided to give it what I believed was true rather than what was in the requirements document. The building has been open for 21 years. I drove by it last year on a Tuesday afternoon, between 3 and 4, and I looked through the window at the children's section. A child was sitting with a book in the light. That is what I built. That is the truest version of what I did for 32 years. Rose understood this about my work in a way that I could not always understand about my own work, because she could see it from the outside in a way that I could not see it from inside the making of it. She used to say that the buildings I was proudest of were the ones that felt like they had always been there, not because they were traditional or historical, but because they had been designed to serve a genuine need so completely that they seemed inevitable in retrospect. She said the same thing about honest paintings. She said the same thing about the letter she wrote. The letter felt, when it was read in the courtroom, like it had always been there. Like the specific truth it contained had been waiting in that envelope for exactly the moment it was needed, because it had been designed, with the specific care of someone who understood what it needed to do, to serve exactly that need and no other. Rose was an architect in the truest sense. She built things that served their purpose completely. She left behind structures that held. I am trying to do the same. I do not always succeed. But I am trying. This is what remains, a year and a half after Rose's death and 8 months after the will contest was dismissed. The house on the street with oak trees. The paintings on the walls, including 2 new ones from the first Tuesday evening auction I attended alone. The small gray notebook in the desk drawer with 53 entries now, 51 of hers and 2 of mine. The letter, which Helen Park returned to me after the proceedings concluded, now in the same locked drawer where I keep the important things. The 1997 will, which Carol gave me a copy of because she thought I should have it, which established that Rose had been thinking about these questions for 26 years before they became my concern. The foundation, which operates every Tuesday evening and which has Elena as one of its 12 current volunteers. Diane, who comes every month and who is learning to see paintings the way Rose saw them, for their honesty rather than their apparent value, which is something that cannot be taught directly but can be absorbed through long exposure to someone who does it consistently. Victor, who called once and has not called since, who is living with what he chose and learning what it costs. Patricia, who has not called at all, who is living with what she chose and learning what it costs. Sandra Norris, who is navigating the legal consequences of a decision she made for $4,000 and who told Thomas Briggs she had not thought it would go this far. Carol Webb, who sent me a note 6 months after the ruling saying that she had included the case in her firm's training materials as an example of effective estate planning under conditions of anticipated challenge. Helen Park, who holds the original letter in her files as a closed matter and who told me, the last time I saw her, that she thought about Rose when she was preparing her own estate documents. Richard, I'm thinking of Thomas Briggs, who came to my kitchen and drank coffee and told me the truest thing anyone said about Victor during the entire process. And Rose, who is in the house and in the paintings and in the notebook and in the letter and in the Tuesday evenings and in the specific quality of attention that I am still learning to apply to the things in front of me, the way she applied it to everything, consistently, carefully, without exception, without self-deception, with the complete commitment of a person who has decided that honesty is not a situational value but a structural one, present in every decision whether or not the decision seems to require it. She is the foundation. She is what holds. And I am going home to her, every Tuesday evening, in the only form going home is available to me now. Going home. She wrote the truth before it had to be said and left it sealed until the moment came the judge read every word aloud that day and what had seemed uncertain became plain. Not magic and not luck and not a fight but one woman's refusal to leave things unclear. She said, I know my children. Here is what I know. And here is what was true. And here is what was dear. The steady father sat and did not speak because his wife had spoken for them both 18 months before the words were needed. She had already given her whole truth. So here's to every love that plans ahead, that says I see what's coming, let me help, that seals an envelope and trusts the moment and gives its best when it can give itself. Don't let them make it ugly. She said so. He heard. He kept that promise. The house still holds it. The paintings are still true. The Tuesday evenings still happen. And Rose is still in all of it. As she always will be. Victor Morrison was 53 years old when the ruling was handed down, and the ruling cost him more than money. He lost the legal contest and the associated court costs. He lost the relationship with his only sibling who had refused to join the contest. He lost, as far as I can tell from the distance I have maintained since our phone call, the specific version of himself he had been constructing, the version of a man who was owed something, who was finally collecting what he was owed, who was taking the action that the situation required. That version of himself had required the contest to succeed in order to remain coherent. When the contest failed, when the letter was read and the payment was documented and the judge wrote 14 pages that were essentially a careful legal way of saying that Rose had known exactly what she was doing and had done it without Victor's help or consent, the constructed version could not sustain itself any longer. What replaced it, I cannot say. I know only what he said on the phone, that he hadn't thought she would have done that, written the letter. That he hadn't thought she was angry at them. She wasn't angry. She was clear. And her clarity, preserved and delivered with the precision she brought to everything, had been the most complete answer available to the story Victor had been telling himself about his mother's marriage and his own entitlement. I hope it was useful to him. I genuinely do. Not for his benefit specifically, but because Rose loved him without illusions, and I think she would have wanted the moment of genuine clarity, however painful and however incomplete, to be useful to him. Whether it was, I cannot know. That belongs to him. Patricia. Patricia Morrison did not call and has not called. I have no information about her inner experience of the ruling's aftermath, and I am not going to speculate about it, because speculation in the absence of information is the specific activity that produces false certainty, and Rose had no patience for false certainty and neither do I. What I can say is this: Patricia was the first to speak in the courtroom, and what she said was delivered in a voice that had been prepared and rehearsed and was entirely committed to its own accuracy. She believed what she was saying, or had convinced herself she believed it, which is a different thing but produces the same external result. When the letter was read, I watched her face the way I had watched Victor's. What I saw was harder to name than what I had seen in Victor, not recognition of something she had known was possible, but something closer to the experience of encountering a fact that does not fit inside the framework you have been using to understand the situation. She had not known about the letter. Victor had not known either. Neither of them had been part of Rose's 3 conversations with Helen Park, and neither of them had suspected that their mother had been, for 18 months, constructing the answer to the question they were eventually going to ask. They had believed the contest was winnable because they had believed they controlled the narrative. The letter removed that control completely. It was Rose's narrative, in Rose's voice, from before the contest existed, and it was the truest account available of everything the contest had been built to contest. Patricia has not called. That is her choice, and I will honor it by not intruding on it. Diane called me the evening after the ruling. She said, "I wanted to make sure you were okay." I told her I was. More than okay, actually. Tired in the way that sustained difficult things leave a person tired, but okay. She said, "I'm glad." Then she said, "Can I ask you something?" I said, "Of course." She said, "Did you know about the letter? Before it was delivered to you?" I told her no. I told her that Helen Park had delivered it 6 months after Rose's death and that I had not known of its existence before that. She was quiet for a moment. "She didn't tell you?" "No," I said. "She didn't tell me either," Diane said. "About the letter or about the 3 conversations?" "I knew she had her own attorney, she had always had her own attorney, separate from yours, but I didn't know what they talked about." "She was careful with information that needed to be kept until it needed to be heard," I said. "I think that applied to you as much as to me." Diane was quiet again. Then she said, "I think she trusted me not to need to know. She knew I wasn't going to contest the will. So she didn't put me in the position of knowing something that might have been difficult to keep." That was, I thought, exactly right. Rose had given each person the version of the truth they needed. Diane had needed only the truth of the marriage itself, which she had observed directly and trusted, not the preparations Rose had made against the contest that Diane had declined to join. "She knew you," I said. "She always did," Diane said. "Better than I sometimes wanted to be known." We talked for an hour. We talked about the foundation and about Elena and about Diane's plans to come the following month and about a painting she had recently acquired at an auction that she wanted to show me. Not a Tuesday evening auction. Diane had started going to Saturday afternoon auctions, which is a different thing, more commercial, more price-driven, but which occasionally yielded the honest thing she was learning to look for. She described the painting she had found and why she had bought it, and the way she described it, for its honesty rather than its apparent value, for what it had been made with rather than what it depicted, told me that the thing Rose had been demonstrating for 44 years of Diane's life had taken root completely. "Mom would have liked it," she said. "Bring it when you come," I said. She did. "It is on the wall now, in the room where the morning light is best. It is honest." Rose would have bid on it. The last Tuesday evening auction Rose attended was 6 weeks before her death. It is the Tuesday that produced the final entry in the gray notebook. I want to tell you about the evening as I remember it, because it is the last ordinary evening I have, and ordinary evenings deserve to be recorded as carefully as extraordinary ones. We drove to the auction in the early evening, when the light in March is still thin and the air is still cold and spring feels like a possibility rather than a certainty. Rose sat in the passenger seat with her hands in her lap and looked out the window at the streets we drove through every week, the streets that had been part of our Tuesday evening routine for 19 years. She was tired. The illness had made her tired in a way that was different from ordinary tiredness, a bone-deep weariness that was present even on the better days, a cost extracted by the disease regardless of what the rest of the day had been. But she had wanted to go. I had asked, because I always asked, and she had said yes, because she almost always said yes, because the Tuesday evening was not contingent on the difficulty of the week. We went. The paintings were not honest that month. This happens, the inventory of a charity auction reflects what donors have given, and sometimes what donors give reflects their own honesty and sometimes it reflects their addicts. That particular month was more addict than honesty. Rose walked through the room with the specific attention she always brought to it, and she did not stop in front of anything long enough to indicate serious consideration, and after 20 minutes she found me near the window where I had been examining a watercolor that ultimately failed on closer inspection, and she said, "Nothing tonight." "Nothing tonight," I agreed. We stayed for another 30 minutes, talking to people we knew from 20 years of attending, drinking sparkling water, looking at the room with the comfortable familiarity of people who have been somewhere so often it feels like a natural extension of their home. Then we went to the car. We sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes. I told her about a project I had been consulting on, a small harbor development that was architecturally interesting in the way that good waterfront projects are interesting, the intersection of functional requirements and the specific challenge of building near water. She listened with her full attention, asking questions at the right moments, the way she always listened to me talk about architecture, not politely but genuinely, because she found architecture genuinely interesting in the way she found most things genuinely interesting. Going home. She wrote that entry later. We drove home through the March dark. The house was warm when we got back, and she made tea while I turned on the lights in the rooms we would use, and we sat for a while longer in the living room with the paintings around us, and then she went to bed and I sat up a little longer, and that was the evening. That was the last ordinary Tuesday. 6 weeks later it was not ordinary anymore. I go back to that evening often, in the way you go back to the last ordinary moment of something, not because it was special, but because ordinary is itself the thing that becomes most precious in retrospect. We went to an auction and found nothing and sat in a parking lot and talked about a harbor project and went home. That was it. That was the whole of it. And it was enough, and she knew it was enough, and she wrote it down. Going home. In the year since the ruling, I have attended 19 Tuesday evening charity auctions. I have bought 11 paintings and declined to bid on hundreds. I have driven home alone after every one of them along the same streets Rose and I drove for 19 years, and I have sat in the parking lot for a few minutes before each drive home, not because I planned to but because the habit of sitting there was built into the Tuesday evening by 20 years of doing it, and habits that are built into a life by someone you love do not simply stop when the person stops. I have sat in the parking lot and thought about the painting I bought or did not buy. I have thought about what Rose would have said about it. I have driven home and made notes in the gray notebook and gone to bed and woken up and continued. Elena comes on Tuesday evenings to the children's hospital and sits with sick children in the pediatric ward and reads to them and talks to them and is present with them in the specific way her grandmother was present, not performing care but actually providing it, with the full attention of someone who has decided that the person in front of them deserves to be fully attended to. She called me one Tuesday evening from the hospital parking lot and said, "Grandpa George, there was a kid tonight who reminded me of Sophie when she was little. Same kind of focused. Asked about every single thing." I said, "What did you do?" She said, "I answered every question. It took a long time." I said, "That's what your grandmother would have done." She said, "I know. That's why I did it." That is what remains. That is what the Tuesday evenings built, across 23 years of Rose attending them and however many years remain of me attending them alone and however many years Elena attends the ones she has made her own. What remains is the habit of showing up. The habit of looking for the honest thing in the room. The habit of sitting with people who need someone to sit with them. The habit of going home afterward and making notes about what you found and what you didn't find and what was worth keeping. Going home. It is the whole of it. It is enough. I have the letter now. Helen Park gave it to me after the proceedings concluded, in the tamper-proof envelope Rose had sealed it in, with the specific instructions Rose had given, which had been satisfied by the opening and the reading, written on a separate page that Helen attached to the outside. The letter itself is on cream paper in Rose's handwriting. 4 pages, double-sided. I have read it so many times the paper has the specific worn quality of something that has been handled repeatedly with care. I keep it in the locked drawer with the important things. The 1997 will. The copy of the ruling. The small gray notebook. I do not read it daily. I read it when I need to hear her voice, which is sometimes often and sometimes not for weeks, depending on what the week has contained. She wrote it for a legal purpose. It served that purpose completely. But the legal purpose was not the whole of what it does. What it does, when I read it alone in my study, is give me Rose's voice, her specific and organized voice, saying the things she would have said, in the way she would have said them, about the marriage and about herself and about the people she loved and the people she understood clearly without loving any less. That is the gift inside the legal gift. That is what she left for me in the letter, beyond the evidence. Her voice. Still here. Still saying what is true. I read it when I need to. I put it back in the drawer when I am finished. I go on. That is all there is to do. That is the steady thing. That is the steady father. Don't let them make it ugly. She said so. Going home. The most honest conversation Rose and I ever had about Victor happened on a Sunday morning in 2015, 7 years before her death and 3 years before any of this began. We were in the kitchen. I was making eggs and she was reading the newspaper, which she still did in print because she had decided that reading news on a screen produced a different relationship with the information than reading it on paper, and she was not interested in the different relationship. Victor had called the previous evening, asking for money. Not the first time. The amount was modest by our standards and the reason given was plausible, and I had been inclined to say yes because saying yes was the path of least resistance, and I had learned that taking the path of least resistance with Victor was consistently less costly in the short term than not taking it. I asked Rose what she thought. She set the newspaper down. She looked at me with the specific expression she wore when she had thought about something thoroughly before being asked about it, which was often. I think giving him the money will make next year's request for money more likely, she said. And I think not giving him the money will create a conflict that will be uncomfortable for several months and will not ultimately change the underlying pattern. So there's no good option, I said. There's a least bad option, she said. Which is to give him the money with full knowledge that you're doing it not because it's the right decision but because the right decision isn't available. I looked at her. You've thought about this more than I have. I think about Victor more than you think I do, she said. Not with worry. Just with attention. What do you think? I asked. About him. She picked up the newspaper again but didn't start reading. She was quiet for a moment. I think he is a man who is angry about things that happened a long time ago, that cannot be changed, and that he has decided to address by collecting from the people he holds responsible. I think he is not going to stop doing this voluntarily. And I think the saddest thing about it is that the anger is not entirely unjustified, and the response to the anger is entirely destructive, and those two things coexist in him in a way that makes it difficult to know how to be in relationship with him without either excusing what he does or dismissing how he feels. She paused. I love him. He is my son. I am not going to stop being in relationship with him. But I am not going to pretend I don't see what I see. I gave Victor the money. The pattern continued as Rose had predicted. She had been entirely right and had known she was right before I asked her and had answered honestly anyway. That is the conversation I think about when I think about what Rose understood about her children and why she wrote the letter. She had been thinking about Victor with attention since long before the contest. She had seen clearly what she saw. She had loved him without letting the love obscure the clarity. The second conversation happened in 2019, 1 year before her diagnosis, on a Tuesday evening in the car on the way to an auction. She said, out of nowhere, "Do you know what I think the best thing about our marriage is?" I said I didn't. She said, "Neither of us has ever tried to make the other person into something they're not." I thought about this. Is that specific to us or is it general advice? Both, she said. I have watched a lot of marriages. The ones that fail, not the ones that end, but the ones that fail on the inside before they end or without ending, are almost always failing because one or both people are trying to make the other into something different. Trying to improve them. Trying to correct them. Trying to change the thing that was there from the beginning. You've never tried to change me? I said. Oh, I've wanted to, she said. In the first 3 years, I wanted to regularly. You had a specific quality of certainty about your own judgment that was infuriating to be around when your judgment was wrong, which it sometimes was. How did you manage not to try to change it? I decided that the quality itself was not the problem, she said. The certainty was part of the same thing that made you good at your work. Removing it would have removed both. So I stopped wanting to remove it and started wanting to find the cases where it was right, which was most of them, and to tolerate the cases where it wasn't, which was a manageable minority. She looked out the window at the streets going by. The best thing about our marriage is that we both made that decision. At some point, in the first few years, we both decided that we were going to be married to this person as this person actually was, not as a version of this person that had been improved according to our own specifications. I never thought of it that way, I said. I know, she said. You thought of it as just accepting who I was. Which is the same thing. You just didn't theorize it. That was true. I had not theorized it. She had theorized it because theorizing was something she did, and the theories she arrived at were almost always accurate, and I had learned to listen to them even when they were describing things I had been doing without knowing I was doing them. The last conversation I am going to tell you about happened 2 months before her death. She had been having a better day than the preceding weeks had produced, less pain, more energy, a quality of presence that the illness had been making intermittent. We sat on the back porch in the early afternoon, because the afternoon light on the back porch in late January has a specific warmth that is the closest thing available to the memory of summer. She said, "George, when I'm gone, I want you to keep going to the Tuesday evening auctions." I said I would. She said, "And I want you to bid on the things that are honest. Even if they're not going to make the reserve. Especially then." I said I would. She said, "And I want you to be okay. Not immediately. But eventually. I want you to be okay." I said I would try. She said, "I know you will. That's not what I'm worried about. What I'm worried about is that you'll try too soon and give up the grief before you've finished with it. Give it the time it needs. Then be okay." I said I would. She leaned back in her chair and looked at the sky over the backyard, the January sky that was thin and pale and not warm but promising in the way of January skies. "I have been so glad," she said. "Of all of it. The whole thing. I'm glad it happened exactly like this." I did not say anything. I held her hand. We sat on the porch until the afternoon light changed and the cold became undeniable, and then we went inside, and that was that afternoon, and it was enough. Going home. It was enough. It always was. I want to tell you, briefly, about each of the paintings currently on the walls of the house on the street with oak trees, because the collection is the most complete record available of 23 years of Tuesday evenings, and because each one has a story, and because Rose believed that everything worth keeping has a story and that the story is part of what makes it worth keeping. The Harbor watercolor, acquired in the first autumn we attended together, 2002, a working harbor at low tide, painted with the specific honesty of someone who understood the smell and weight of a harbor rather than its picturesque possibilities. Rose said it was the most functional painting she had ever seen. I did not know what she meant for several years, and then I understood exactly. The winter figure, acquired in 2005 at a hospital gala where the crowd was louder than the art deserved, a person in a winter coat walking away from the viewer through what appears to be early snow, the figure small against a large pale sky, the painting about the distance between a person and the weather around them. Rose said she bought it because it felt true to the experience of winter in a way that most winter paintings were not. I have found this to be accurate every January since. The drawing, the pencil study from the first Tuesday evening I attended alone, a figure at a table, working on something not visible to the viewer, the quality of concentration in the figure's posture so specific that it reads as portraiture even though no face is visible. I bought it because it reminded me of Rose at her desk. It still does. 11 more paintings, each with a story, each acquired because someone had made it with genuine intention rather than with the intention to please, each sitting on the wall of a house that holds everything it holds. The last 2 entries in the gray notebook are mine. The notations are less precise than Rose's. I do not have her eye for the specific quality of what makes a thing honest, and my descriptions reflect this, but they are as honest as I can make them, which is the only standard that applies. The collection is growing slowly. 1 or 2 paintings per year, at the current pace. By the time I am unable to attend the Tuesday evening auctions, the walls will hold whatever they hold, and whoever comes after me will find the notebook in the desk drawer and will be able to read, entry by entry, the record of 23 years of Tuesday evenings that produced it. I hope they read the notebook. I hope they understand what they are reading. Going home. She wrote. Going home. I write now. That is all. That is the whole of it. The house holds everything it holds. The paintings tell their honest tales. The gray notebook in the drawer records the Tuesday evenings, without fail. A woman loved a man for years and knew him, and prepared his ground and left behind the exact right words so truth, when needed, could be found. The court was quiet when she spoke, though she had died a year before. The letter carried every word, and when it landed, nothing more was needed. It was done. It held. As honest things are built to hold. The steady father kept his word. The story, now, is fully told. People who knew Rose have, in the year and a half since her death, told me the things she said to them that they remember most clearly. I have been collecting these, informally, the way I collect the Tuesday evening paintings, one at a time, as they appear, with attention to their honesty. Helen Park told me Rose always said, "Never let the document be more complicated than the intention it serves." Carol Webb, who met Rose only through the letter but who felt she knew her from it, said the letter embodied a principle she had heard articulated once at a legal conference. The most effective testimony is the one given before the question has been asked. Diane told me, Rose said, when Diane was in her 20s and struggling with a difficult relationship, you can love a person and also see them clearly. The seeing doesn't damage the loving. It informs it. Elena told me that when she was 8 years old and had lost something important and was crying about it, Rose had said, everything that is genuinely lost leaves something behind. The leaving behind is not the loss. The leaving behind is what you keep. And I remember, on the Tuesday evening she told me about the marriage, about neither of us trying to change the other. She said something at the end that I had half forgotten until now. The best relationships are the ones in which both people have decided to be exactly who they are, and to trust that the other person can handle it. Most people hedge. They present a version of themselves that is designed to be acceptable. The brave thing is to be the actual version and to trust that the actual version is enough. She was the actual version. She was always the actual version. She did not hedge and she did not perform and she did not present a version of herself designed to be acceptable to the people who would eventually contest her will. She simply was who she was, completely and without apology, and she trusted that who she was enough. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. And the letter she wrote, in her actual voice, about her actual marriage, in her actual handwriting on her actual cream paper, was the truest expression of who she actually was that I can offer you, and the fact that she wrote it 18 months before it was needed, and sealed it, and trusted that it would arrive at the right moment in the right hands, is the clearest evidence I have that the actual version of Rose Hadley was more than enough for any room she ever walked into, including the courtroom where Patricia pointed at me and said this man manipulated my dying mother. She had already answered that. From 18 months away. The actual version. It was enough. It always is. That is the steady father. Go home. On the morning I am writing this, not George Hadley, but the channel, the story, the voice that has been narrating everything you have heard today, it is a Tuesday. It has been a Tuesday this whole time, actually, in the sense that this is the story of what Tuesday evenings were and what they became and what they still are, 1 year and a half after the person who made them what they were is gone. The steadiness is not the absence of grief. It is what remains alongside the grief. The Tuesday evenings continue. The paintings go on the wall. The notebook fills. The foundation funds volunteers who sit with sick children and ask them questions and listen to the answers with their whole bodies. The steady father does not stop. He does not pretend the loss is not real. He does not minimize what was taken or overstate what has been restored. He simply continues, going to Tuesday evening auctions, bidding on the honest things, sitting in parking lots, driving home, making notes, being present with the people who need presence, keeping the promises he made. Don't let them make it ugly. She said so. He hasn't. He won't. The house holds everything it holds. Going home. Rose bid on a painting once that nobody else wanted. She raised it from $300 to $502, alone, because it was the honest painting in the room and it deserved to find its minimum. A man standing nearby made a remark about stubbornness. She turned around. He looked alarmed. This was informative. She let him help with the last $2. She went to dinner with him the following week. She married him 3 years later. She spent 19 years going to Tuesday evening auctions with him and finding the honest paintings and making notes in a gray notebook and sitting in parking lots on the way home and talking about architecture and about Victor and about what she had decided about marriage and about the specific quality of winterlight in a painting she had bought in 2005. She wrote a letter 18 months before she died and sealed it and gave it to a careful woman who knew when to open it. The letter was opened. The truth was read aloud. The court was quiet. The house still holds the paintings. The Tuesday evenings still happen. The gray notebook is in the desk drawer. The letter is in the locked drawer with the important things. Going home. She wrote. Going home. That is the steady thing. That is everything. Going home. The house is on a street with oak trees. It has been there for 21 years since Rose and I bought it together on a bright spring afternoon when everything felt possible and the mortgage felt enormous, and we signed the papers and drove home, and she said, let's make dinner tonight in our kitchen, and I said, we don't have any food in it yet, and she said, so we'll go to the store first, and we went to the store and we made dinner in our kitchen that first night, and the kitchen has held every dinner since and will hold whatever dinners remain, and that is enough. That is the whole of it. Going home, she wrote. Going home. The steady father goes home. He keeps going home. Every Tuesday. Every morning. Every time there is a parking lot to sit in and a painting to assess and a notebook to make notes in and a house with oak trees to return to. Going home is the steady thing. Going home is the steady father. Going home is everything. And she was the most careful person he knew with things that needed to be kept until they needed to be heard. She kept 19 years of marriage honestly. She kept 3 conversations with her attorney carefully. She kept the letter sealed for 18 months until the moment it was needed. She kept the love for her children alongside the clear sight of who they were. She kept the Tuesday evening habit through 23 years of paintings that were sometimes honest and sometimes not. She kept going. She kept him. She kept everything worth keeping. And when she could not keep it any longer, she put it in the hands of people who could, Helen Park and Carol Webb and George Hadley and Diane and Elena, and she trusted them to keep it forward. They have. They will. The steady father goes home. Rose goes with him. That is the whole of it. Going home. Going home. Going home.